So hello and welcome to the Major Projects Association podcast. My name is Janet Greenwood and I am the Global Lead for Sustainable Infrastructure at KPMG, and I'm particularly proud to say that I am also the Chair of the Major Projects Association Sustainability Ambassadors. And that's why I've been asked to host this special edition of the MPA podcast. I'm joined today by two distinguished experts from the fields of planning and major projects, and I'm delighted to introduce Imogen Dewar and Robbie Owen from Pinsent Masons. I'd really like to know a little bit about both of you before we start getting into some of the discussion around sustainability and planning and consents in major projects. Imogen, tell me a bit about yourself.
Thank you, Janet. It is wonderful to be here with you this afternoon. Absolutely delighted to be able to speak to the MPA. So thank you for that introduction. My name is Imogen Dewar. I'm a Senior Associate in the Planning and Environment team at Pinsent Masons. So we are lawyers. We have one of the largest planning and environment teams in the UK, and we act on the consenting of major infrastructure projects, a whole range of projects from energy and infrastructure project types. My specialism and what I'm really passionate and interested about is the interface between major projects and the natural environment. So we'll work on the full life cycle of development, but really interested in particular issues around climate change and biodiversity net gain. My current practice at the moment is a lot of renewable development, in particular offshore wind throughout the country. And Robbie, if I pass to you.
Yes, well, good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Robbie Owen. I'm a partner at Pinsent Masons, and I head up our infrastructure planning and government affairs team here in the UK. And I spent my whole career advising on what I call the front end of major projects, getting them consent, and indeed before then getting them a proper policy and legislative basis. And I've been delighted to, in various different ways, to have been associated with the Major Projects Association since the early 2000s. And my focus and my passion has been getting approvals for these large, complex, difficult projects, normally central government approvals because they're of the size and importance that require central government approval, often involving direct parliamentary legislation in relation to the project concerned, as well as a lot of politics around the project. And I'm passionately interested in terms of how these projects are set up for delivery, really, and understanding that our role and the role of my colleagues here in relation to consenting of projects is a key part in their successful delivery, and making sure there's a continuous thread to successful delivery from the very beginning, as opposed to there being cliff faces and cliff edges and all those risks that would produce. So that's me, and I think interestingly, I've been at this job for quite some years now. And when I first started in the late 1980s, the whole subject of sustainability was very different to what it is now. Environmental impact assessment had only just come in as an obligation from the European Directive of 1985, and wow, since then it's been a huge transformation change, and very much for the better in terms of making sure sustainability considerations are at the forefront of decisions on how projects are from inception onwards, really, including how they're consented and the conditions of consent to make sure that sustainability is first and foremost in mind.
Imogen, Robbie, thank you. Great introductions there. And you've landed on a few things that I'd like to pick up on. We're talking about planning, we're talking about major projects, and we all know that you can't just go and build what you would like wherever you would like. We know that there are planning consents, and we know that sometimes that gets quite sticky press. But before we dive into some of the challenges around the process, particularly with regards to sustainability, Robbie, could I come to you, and could you just give us a very brief high-level outline of what are we talking about when we're talking about the planning system and consents? Why can't we just go and build anywhere? What's the process?
It's a simple question, quite a complex answer potentially, but essentially, especially with the large infrastructure projects, whether linear projects or not, you need a whole, because of the way our laws are written in terms of laws saying you can't do certain things without planning permission, you can't do certain things without environmental permits. You can imagine there's a whole list of permissions, licenses, permits, and other things that are needed. Because if you don't get them, you commit criminal offences, and therefore, typically, for the kind of projects that Imogen and I deal with, you need much more than just a simple planning permission like you would get if you wanted to extend your house, and therefore the processes can be quite complex in terms of what you have to do in order to apply for this larger bundle of consents, if we can put it that way, and in terms of what you have to do by way of assessing and appraising what you want permission for in terms of the impact of your project on the environment in particular. And then there will be a process, they vary depending on quite what procedure you are in. There'll be a process for everyone to have to be able to have their say on the project that you're seeking permission for. There may be provision for a public inquiry, or alternatively, it may be a process dealt with in writing where representations can be submitted by all sorts of people who want to participate in the process, whether they're local individuals, whether they're local authorities, whether they're statutory bodies who have a role and want to make sure that the project you're seeking consent for won't harm their own interests and make their job harder. So, and then ultimately someone will have to make a decision on the application for consent, whether it's the local authority or more often in the kind of projects Imogen and I are dealing with, the decision will be by a minister of the United Kingdom government, or sometimes the Welsh government or the Scottish government. And then after that, increasingly we're seeing nowadays legal challenges being made to the grant of permission if permission is granted, and that's a challenge not by way of an appeal, because most of these processes, certainly the ones run by central government where you're applying to a minister for consent, there's no right of appeal, but ministers have to act in accordance with the law. They have to act lawfully, and there's a whole body of law that's grown up over the decades, setting out how ministers must act. It's called public law, and increasingly we're finding permissions for projects being challenged by a process known as judicial review, because the challenger, the objector, doesn't like the project and is alleging that the decision to grant it was taken in the wrong way. So it's a process to sort of take issue with the way in which the decision was taken, and the allegation is the decision was taken in the wrong way, which makes it an unlawful decision. And if the court agrees with you, the matter is sent back to the decision maker to have another go and do it properly and lawfully this time. So we're seeing a huge rise in judicial reviews in relation to major projects, whether infrastructure or others, and that is definitely sustainability issues are very much at the forefront of that.
Well, that leads me nicely, Robbie, thank you, on to my next question. I'll come to you, Imogen. So I think we've established that the planning system is designed to hold the tension between sort of the greater good, the local good, the needs of nature. And there's loads of routes that you can follow. It's not a choice, you will be guided, but it could be a development consent order for some of the really big projects, Transport and Works Acts. We've mentioned town and country planning, although we're much more familiar with that for the backyard extension. So we know that in theory, you have a good idea for a project, you start to scope out what it might look like, you start to engage with stakeholders and the planning authorities, you have some backwards and forwards, you get your consents, you agree it, and then you work within them. That's how it should work. And I've made it all sound very simple there. I know when I joined Tideway, they'd just joined just 2 weeks before the DCO was granted, and I seem to recall that the documentation for Tideway took up 15 metres of shelving. It was something of that order. So these are weighty processes. Imogen, What's the matter with the planning system? Why do people feel it's not working very well, and it's not working very well for the environment? I know Robbie just mentioned about the judicial reviews, the JRs, but what are some of the challenges within the planning system at present?
Yeah, well, this is a big focus of attention, and I think one of the reasons that the planning system has always carried quite a lot of controversy and continues to be quite controversial is because at the core, the planning system is about where should we have developments and why. And people are quite emotionally attached to their land for very good reason. And particularly for major projects, those will have large impacts. So the consenting of major projects is fundamentally about where should we put these big projects, which do have sometimes quite adverse environmental impacts on amenity in the local community, and to conflict that against why we need these big projects in the first place. And at the core, it's about having big government policy which says we need certain things versus local communities then having to facilitate and house those things. So that is the overall big picture. You then come down to the smaller questions that make up, well, how do we go about this tension? How do we go about bringing forward these projects with that tension? And that comes down to things like, well, how much say should a local community have, and how much weight should be given to a local community's views and interests, and what should be done by a major project to try and mitigate against the impacts on that local community, or to provide some sort of additional benefit to that local community. Planning has always been controversial for those reasons, and there's a lot of work going on by government at the moment to try and pursue consultation and reform. Big flagship changes like how judicial reviews can be brought, that Robbie's mentioned. The government's consulting on ways to bring forward changes in how those judicial review challenges can be brought, but also things like community benefit reform and how much community benefit can be given by a developer to a local project. So planning is a controversial area because it's right at that forefront of how we feel about how we live and where these big projects should be based. And the government at the moment is pushing big reforms on that whole planning system. So there's a lot for developers to have to be keeping on top of at the moment.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned about some of the changes that are coming, because I think there has been a perception in government that the judicial review, that the balance of challenge versus progress has become out of whack. I think that's their perception. We know about there's some upcoming changes to the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Are you able to shed any light on where we're up to with that?
Yes, absolutely. So the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is one of this government's flagship proposed changes to the planning system. It proposes a wide variety of amendments to how we bring forward big challenges, big projects, apologies. Currently, it's gone through its first and second reading, and so it's been through House of Commons stage and been through a number of amendments at House of Commons stage. It's currently sitting in the House of Lords, so what that means is they are batting further amendments, so it will go through that stage and then it will come back to Commons to debate and discuss the House of Lords proposed changes, and then there will be a final vote on the bill. At a very high level, part of what the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is seeking to do is bring forward strategic approaches to delivering environmental mitigation and to assisting nature recovery. So this is that strategic approach to bringing forward big developments is a big part of government's agenda that it's bringing forward in a variety of different ways, whether we see that also in biodiversity net gain, but also specific to offshore wind, the Marine Recovery Fund. And what these strategic ways of bringing about mitigation are trying to do is saying, we as government want to make things easier or more streamlined to bring forward major development. So in terms of environmental mitigation and nature recovery, we will set up government funds and government strategic mechanisms to deliver nature recovery rather than individual projects delivering that on a project by project basis. And the underlying thinking for that is that that will streamline things for the projects themselves, but also lead to better and improved environmental outcomes because mitigation will be delivered holistically. So this is part of a big package of measures that's seeking that strategic approach.
Imogen, thank you. And coming to you, Robbie, I know that there has been some controversy around the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Some people feel that nature will be less protected. But of course, the bill is only one part of the legal framework. There's also case law. And I know there have been some really interesting recent cases that have led to a change in case law. I'm thinking perhaps about Finch and the implications of that. So I wonder if you could shed a little bit of light about what that case law is and the implications it has had and may have on some future projects.
Yes, so the recent cases that you're referring to all look at sort of what are the obligations on a developer in the course of their application for consent to assess the impact of the project they want to build and operate in respect of carbon. And this is because we've had, as I mentioned in the introduction, in the UK since 1988, we've had the obligation to carry out as part of your application for consent, whether you're Town and Country Planning Act or any other consenting regime, there's the obligation to conduct an environmental impact assessment of the effects of building and operating the project concerned, including in relation to impact on carbon. And the case of Finch concerned planning permission that was given by Surrey County Council for an oil extraction facility in the Surrey Hills. So the consent was in relation to the drilling rig and immediate sort of related plant and equipment. But in a landmark judgment last year, the Supreme Court held that the downstream emissions of the extracted oil, that is the emissions of the combusted oil once used and burned, had to be assessed in the planning application for the extraction plant. And that was the case even though the extraction plant for which planning permission had been given had no control clearly on where the oil would be sent and whatever purpose it was to be used for, or any intermediate step for the refinement of the oil. And the court held that those emissions, however, those downstream emissions ought to have been assessed, and those carbon emissions ought to have been assessed, and information about the assessment and those carbon emissions should have been put before the council as decision maker on the planning application as part of a complete environmental impact assessment. So this was quite a shock to many commentators and others, because until then it had been assumed that the rules relating to how far you have to go to conduct an environmental impact assessment didn't include such indirect or sort of downstream impacts. But the court, it was a majority decision, I think from memory 3-2, decided that actually that had been wrong, and therefore the planning permission was quashed, was so basically overruled by the Supreme Court, because the environmental impact assessment hadn't been done properly as required by regulations. And that judgment, the Finch judgment as we call it, was seen by industry to be a substantial change, because before Finch and that judgment, a project wouldn't typically assess the downstream or upstream, indeed, carbon impacts of its development. And fairly soon after the Finch judgment, planning permission for another project, the Cumbrian coal mine facility, which many listeners will recall, was also challenged in court, because planning permission was given by the UK government. It was then challenged in court, and the UK government, in effect, threw the towel in and didn't defend the legal challenge. And then there was actually a third case relating to oil and gas licenses for the Rosefield and Jackdaw oil fields in the North Sea. So this is having really quite a ramification for all sorts of projects at the pre-planning and planning and consenting stage, to make sure that they go through the environmental impact assessment hoop sort of properly and don't succumb to the same problems. And soon after the judgment was issued, the government published guidance on the assessment of downstream and upstream emissions for the oil and gas industry. But this issue clearly, though, isn't specific to the oil and gas industry. The underlying legislation central to the Finch case, namely the environmental impact assessment regulations, that applies equally across a suite of major projects, including projects under the Development Consent Order regime or the Transport Works Act. So the final point on this really is that we've seen in the months since Finch, it's been a year or so now, we're seeing examples of how major projects are interpreting the Finch ruling. For instance, the recently consented Luton Airport expansion for an additional terminal building there, that grappled with this issue by the applicants making a detailed submission during the process leading up to the decision to give consent, a detailed submission on the potential upstream and downstream impacts that could arise as a result of an expanded airport there by way of the new terminal, such as increased carbon emissions from increased economic activity. So, but it's early days, I think, in terms of how projects are reacting to the Finch judgment.
Thank you. And Imogen, I'll come to you. I'd like to move into the so what. If you are listening to this and you are a client or a sponsor, really at the beginning of the early stages of your project, I know, Robbie, in your intro, you mentioned about setup and front end. What does it all mean for you if you're trying to focus on sustainability? And then later, if you are perhaps a program director in the development stages of a project, what kind of things should you do differently? But before I come to you, Imogen, I would just like to have a little word about the word sustainability. We throw the word around, but it's perhaps worth saying that it is a very much an all-encompassing world. I often like to talk about it as having 4 pillars: biodiversity and nature, resilience and adaptation, carbon and the environment, air, water, waste, and social value. So it is a very broad and wide and encompassing word. But if we're thinking about sustainability, and Imogen, if you are a client or a project really at those early inception stages of a project, what should you do differently now to get things right first time?
Absolutely, and completely agree that term sustainability in the planning sphere is a little opaque. And so the first thing that a project can do is try to be clear on what all these changes that we've been discussing in this podcast are, and start to really write down on paper and map out what those mean for your project. And to take 2 of the examples that we've mentioned so far, those are on the carbon side, so the Finch case that Robbie's just been discussing, and upstream and downstream impacts. There's what to do from a carbon perspective, but also what to do from a biodiversity net gain, a BNG perspective, which we haven't touched on so much so far. So firstly, from a carbon perspective, the question is that a project and a developer really needs to be testing itself on what could its upstream and downstream impacts be. And the onus of the Finch judgment is to push the envelope on what project thinks those downstream impacts could be, which may be much broader than had been interpreted prior to the Supreme Court's ruling in Finch. So the point of that question is to say, well, what could my upstream and downstream impacts be? Because it's no longer good enough for a project to be able to say, well, my downstream impacts are abroad, or they're subject to an intermediate process, or they're really far away, or someone else gets a license or controls that activity. No longer can that be a reasonable defence. The question instead is there a causal connection between what your project is doing and those emissions arising? That's the new question that has to be asked in light of Finch. And that does involve quite a bit of going back to the drawing boards at the beginning of a project's life to consider that question. And that can be quite a complex question. So what we would do as lawyers is come in and, in light of that judgment, help to tease out that potentially quite challenging question in light of all the case law and the new guidance that's been developing as a result. Because it also comes down to things like considering your alternatives. So have you considered the carbon intensity of an alternative way of bringing forward your scheme? So there's the carbon side, and then also the nature side, the BNG side, which is a huge topic in itself.
Well, and I'm very keen to get onto that. So it's really worth, as a client, getting your head around that at an early stage, that perhaps the carbon impact of your project is much more broadly defined in law than you previously thought about. And so therefore that impacts your likelihood of getting consent, which either means you might want to think about an alternative solution, or you have to think very seriously about mitigation. So early consideration, consultation with experts, really critical. Robbie, I'm keen to go back to Imogen on nature, but yes, Robbie.
Yeah, just before we talk about nature, I mean, I think in relation to, I liked your definition, or the way you broke down sustainability into the 4 different areas, Janet. I think I haven't heard that before, and I think that's a very user-friendly way of looking at sustainability, because it does mean different things to different people. But I think this is such a big issue now, and has become a big issue, rightly so, over the last few years. And I think what is necessary, really, if you're a program director in the development stages of a project, is just to be super aware of this from the very beginning, not just in terms of what are the effects and impacts of your project in sustainability terms, but also build in sustainability into the project objectives in the very first place. So, for example, having a really clear programme in terms of what are the community benefits of this project. We're seeing government, quite belatedly, I think, this government and indeed the last government, beginning to make some progress with community benefits in relation to low carbon energy infrastructure, but we need to be much better about community benefit across all different sectors of infrastructure. So it's really just a full awareness of the issues, not just how they affect feasibility, considering alternatives, appraisal of the impact of your chosen scheme, but also how you then, throughout the life cycle of the construction and then operation of the project, deal with sustainability issues in a way that's acceptable and responsible. For example, how do you deal with them as part of procuring construction? How do you pass on to the contractor your obligations in relation to sustainability considerations? But how do you do that in a way that maintains necessary flexibility to get the project built? Because you'll come across during construction unknown issues to which you will need to find a solution. So there are all sorts of tensions there, but just being much more aware of these issues from the very beginning in terms of project inception onwards. And I know the MPA is always really, rightly so, keen about getting project inception done appropriately. And we've seen quite a few projects recently where you can see that actually the inception stage wasn't done well, because things then began to unravel. But if you do project inception well, what that means nowadays is including in that a really full, mindful treatment and consideration of sustainability issues.
Thank you, Robbie. And Imogen, I jumped in before you got onto nature, which is a subject very dear to my heart, but you mentioned biodiversity net gain and the importance for projects. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a huge topic in itself, but to flag the key elements is that biodiversity net gain is now a legal requirement. So it's in place for town and country planning developments. It's been in place for a year and a half now there, and it's coming into force for the major projects, the nationally significant infrastructure projects subject to a DCO in May 2026. So that is the date by which biodiversity net gain will need to be secured and achieved by a project. What does that mean? It means that when you're bringing forward a development, you will need to obtain or deliver a 10% gain in the biodiversity of the habitat compared to the baseline environment before you started development. So that is a new legal requirement, particularly for those NSIT developments where it's due to come into effect next year. It's quite an onerous commitment for developers to think about how they achieve that gain in biodiversity, and it affects all aspects of a development because it's how you bring about your mitigation and how you bring about your planting scheme. So how do you get the land that you need to deliver that, and how do you work with landowners in the local community to get the right planting in the right place? And it's how you do your site selection alternatives to make sure that you're not impacting particularly sensitive habitats that would be difficult to replace or are irreplaceable and very high priority. So it affects all aspects of development's life. It's a big change coming in next year, and the key message for developers there really is they need to be thinking about how to design their projects in a careful and sensitive way to work with nature to achieve that net gain.
Absolutely. And Imogen, the need to regenerate nature, particularly on the UK, we often hear it's a very much nature depleted island, and it's very true. Globally, the World Wildlife Fund has found that since 1970, 73% of the monitored populations of amphibians, birds, fish, mammals, the populations have decreased by 73%. Which is an absolutely terrifying statistic. And we know that we have an ambition in the UK to have 30 by 30, a 30% increase by 2030. And these turnarounds are not going to happen unless we put a lot of focus on it. And we are wholly dependent, of course, on nature for our oxygen, our water, and our food. So it makes sense to make it a priority. And a last question from me, which I'll throw open to both of you. I've worked on Lower Thames Crossing, on Tideway, and been super aware of the need to comply with the DCO, to get the right DCO, to work within the red line. Robbie, you mentioned about non-compliance being criminal. You know, this is serious stuff. And yet there is often a tension between having to be pinned down at relatively an early stage and actually not knowing all the answers because you're still at that early stage. We've got lots of challenges, particularly around sustainability. We've got a finite supply of low carbon concrete, a finite supply of low carbon steel, and probably our pipelines of projects exceed those quantities. So who's going to get those materials, and what do we do if we don't get those materials? There's a lot of unanswered questions about how we bake sustainability into the DCOs, which will then be held to account to. And I just wanted to throw that open to you, Robbie and Imogen. You know, how do we hold this tension between knowing we have to do better and committing to it and being held to account, but actually in a world of huge uncertainties and a new territory?
I think quite how you do that will clearly depend. The solution will depend on each project, and I think the key thing here, and it follows what I was saying earlier, that making sure sustainability issues are forefront in the project's mind, including the program director from the very beginning, from inception onwards. I think the key thing you do that is you look at this on a whole project life cycle basis, because the very worst thing you can do is to put together and draft and construct a beautifully written DCO, but which actually is entirely devoid of any reality in terms of quite how the project is going to be delivered in terms of construction and then operation and maintenance. And it's really therefore completely critical to make sure that constructability and all of the issues to do with sustainability throughout the life cycle are fully considered at the consenting stage, to make sure that the DCO does get that balance right and doesn't offer up commitments that actually are then undeliverable, because certainly breaching requirements of a development consent order, you know, the conditions and other provisions, that is a criminal offence, and clearly companies do not want to contemplate that, and therefore often you find that development consent orders are issued, but then actually the project realises a year or two later that they can't deliver on some of the conditions of them, and therefore they have to go back through the process again to get them varied. So I think it's really making sure that the requirements for a sustainable construction and operation and maintenance phase are fully factored in from the very beginning, so that you're not drafting your development consent order in isolation and in a vacuum, and that you're doing so in a fully mindful way.
Thank you, Robbie. Imogen, a last word from you.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, but just a slightly different angle is I think there will become a point at which there needs to be clarity of the role of an individual project and its requirements to help meet carbon reduction measures versus wider government carbon reduction targets. So at the moment, it can be quite unclear what the role of an individual project is against those large government targets. And that is a key area of challenge and attack for projects. And it is quite difficult for a project on a project alone basis to square that circle. So I would be asking for further guidance from government about how to approach that big question of what is the role of an carbon intensive project that we ultimately need for other reasons compared to delivering those 2015 net zero aims.
And just staying with carbon for the moment, there are standards being published now. The PAS has been out for several years, revised in the last year or two, PAS 2080, the carbon methodology. And really, if you're not adopting those, embedding those, following those, you could be perceived, even though they're not mandated, to be vulnerable if you're not following best practice. So there is guidance out there, but it is a very complex area, and getting experts in early, probably a wise move. Robbie Owen, Imogen Dewar from Pinsent Masons, I'd just like to say thank you so much for a really interesting foray into the world of infrastructure planning.
It's been really enjoyable.
Thanks so much.
Oh, pleasure. I'd like to do a bit of a plug for the Major Projects Association Sustainability Playbook. It's on the website, No Planet B, and it does talk about roles and stages of the projects and things you need to consider at every stage of the project. So do check it out if you haven't already. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you found that really interesting, and it's been my pleasure and privilege to host the Major Projects Association podcast. Thank you.